transmitir.
Will I know when it's time for me to talk?
I will give you, Lisa, the word for before a brief presentation.
Excellent, thank you.
Great. Estamos entonces al aire, Paz. Les damos la bienvenida desde la Facultad de Teología de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile a este webinar donde tenemos la gracia, la alegría de recibir a Lisa Oakley, a quien presento, nuestra panelista esta tarde. Ella es investigadora del tema del abuso desde el año 2003. Obtuvo su doctorado en el 2009 sobre abuso espiritual en Manchester Metropolitan University. Ha escrito y ha expuesto sobre este tema a nivel internacional y a nivel nacional. Es coautora de un libro muy importante, un referente, Breaking the Silence of Spiritual Abuse, de 2013, cuya versión de difusión, podemos decir así, Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse, de 2019, hemos visto salir y hemos agradecido, y además tenemos la alegría, Lisa, de saber que está pronto a salir su versión en español. Queremos presentar a quien, como he dicho, experta en la cuestión de la prevención, se ha dedicado largamente, y para nosotros es una alegría tenerla en nuestro webinar esta mañana desde Chile, esta tarde desde allá, para reflexionar sobre el tema del abuso espiritual y el abuso de conciencia. Lisa Oakley, bienvenida.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I know that I've had an introduction, so just a little more information. Perhaps I'm currently an associate professor at the University of Chester. I am a Christian and I am working across denominations in the UK, including the Catholic faith. And most of my work is in the area of spiritual abuse, but also healthy Christian cultures. How do we create them? So what I'm going to do is to share with you some of the research that we've conducted and what we found. I'm going to try to explain where I think there are specific elements that are relevant to the Catholic context, or perhaps where there are differences, and also then have some time for questions after. So I'm going to share some slides, which I'll make a version of available after. So I'm hoping you can see those now. I'm going to trust that you can. So just to give a little bit of background, I've conducted a number of research studies in this area of faith and safeguarding, but on the slide, I've highlighted 3 studies that I've conducted in this area, one on my own and others with colleagues. And those are what this talk will draw on. So my first study was conducted in 2009, and I took people's narrative accounts of spiritual abuse in the Christian faith in the UK. In 2012, 2013, myself and a colleague conducted something called the Church Experience Survey, and to complete it, people had to either attend church or previously have attended church. 525 respondents completed it, and we asked them questions about the positive aspects of church and the negative aspects of church. And they told us the positive things were about belonging and feeling part of a family. And the negative parts were where they didn't feel like they belonged, or where they experienced control or coercion. And so many listed abusive practices as reasons why they left churches. And just to give you a little flavour of that research, 50% who responded said they didn't feel able to ask questions in their church context. 31% said they had never felt able to do that in their previous church context. Over 70% said they had felt manipulated at some point in time. 45% said they felt scripture was used to control their behaviour. The good news is that 99% felt they're uplifted at some point by a church experience, but 74% felt damaged by a church experience at some point. The largest piece of research that I've conducted in this area with an independent Christian safeguarding charity called 318 was between 2016 and 2018. And there were 1,591 respondents to that survey, 1,002 of whom self-identified as having experienced spiritual abuse. So that was quite a significant number. So from those pieces of research, we developed a definition of spiritual abuse, which is what you can see on the slide. I'm not going to go through the whole of it at this point, because I'm going to look at the different elements throughout the talk. But I think it's important to note that the term spiritual abuse within the UK is somewhat controversial still. Not everywhere, but in some places. And the language does matter, but our focus has been on identifying and addressing harm. So the key things to note here are we're not arguing for a separate category of spiritual abuse. We see it as a form of psychological and emotional abuse, and those are statutory categories for us. It's also important to say that what that research, particularly the last piece, showed us was that leaders and priests and clergy can and do experience spiritual abuse themselves. I can hear some feedback now, but I think that's okay.
Was that leaders and priests and clergy can and do experience.
Shall I just carry on? Yep, okay, that's brilliant, thank you. So what I'm going to do is talk through some of the key elements of coercion and control, which runs across this whole experience of spiritual abuse. So one of the things we found from the research was that decision-making can look like it's shared, but often is being carefully controlled by an individual or a group of people. One of the key things also was not being able to ask questions or to raise issues. One writer in this area says, if you raise a problem, you become the problem. And censorship, so either explicitly or implicitly being told to keep quiet if you are unhappy or you have a concern. One of the participants said, I was told to keep my head down and my mouth shut and look on it as a case of keeping unity. I'm just going to click these on and then talk through them. For some people, gender is part of their experience and a means of control. For many people, there is a requirement for increasing commitment either to the individual or to the context, and importantly, that being equated to your commitment to God. Also, there can be a real focus on obedience. So obedience to God, again, being equated to obedience to an individual or individuals. And lots of people's stories included acceptance and rejection. So feeling isolated or being isolated when they were not doing what was expected, and being accepted when they were. And that was quite a controlling part of their experience. One writer talks about feeling like they were in a solitary confinement cell within a church. Other aspects which participants talked about in their stories, and I think these are really important to understand. One of them was what I've called divine position, but the idea that somebody has been anointed or placed into a position and therefore they can't be questioned. So if we think about the Catholic context, many of times where I've presented work, people have talked about the role of the priest and how the priest has a position within a congregation, within a church, which by its nature holds power. Now, I know that when you explore abuse of conscience or conscience abuse, that you wouldn't have a confession being made to somebody who has spiritual authority over you. But I think that power dynamics are much more complex than that. And so one of the things that we have been exploring is personal power and relational power. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later in the talk. But I think it's really important to note that you can hold power in many different ways, and therefore you can be in a position to control and coerce people through the position and the relationships that you have. We also see the use of scripture and teaching as a powerful tool within spiritual abuse. So using scripture to coerce or control behaviour, but also importantly, the use of biblical discourses, for example, about submission, obedience, sacrifice, and forgiveness, and how those can be used to control behaviour. One of the biggest things that people have talked about in their experience is fear. People are scared. They're scared to speak out. They're scared to get it wrong. They're scared of spiritual consequences for their actions. So a number of people have perhaps had spiritual threats about what God might think about them, or whether they will go to heaven. And those are really powerful threats. One of the things I think it's important to talk about in the context of the Catholic Church is many people have shared with me the idea of reverential fear. So that reverence that they might have for somebody, creating a fear of disobeying or displeasing that person. Sometimes we see superiority and elitism. So this is the best church, this is the best place for you to be. And that can lead to external isolation. So not mixing with others, not seeing another reality. But also lots of accounts of manipulation and exploitation. And the rationale for that being a spiritual one, or God being seen as complicit in that controlling and coercive experience. That's a very brief overview of some of the key characteristics, but we're going to look at, as we go through, at the impact of this experience and what this does to people when they have these experiences. One of the things I developed in my research was this process model. So what's the process of people's experiences? Many people have very positive experiences at the start, and that's a good thing. But then they might have a catalyst moment. So a catalyst for us is like a chemical reaction where something changes and it can't change back. So they might have a moment where they start to question what they're part of. And then there's usually a period of recommitment. And that circle continues for quite some time. So there might be an experience of control and coercion, spiritual abuse, and then there might be a recommitment and that will progress round until there is a final catalyst. And actually, that might be a very small event, but it's just one event too many. And then usually, but not always, the person will leave the context. And then there are a series of long-term impacts I'll go on to explain. I think what's important to say here is that we don't know that much about this area, and we're still researching it, because many people, when they leave these experiences, those experiences are not talked about, they're not recognized, and so people don't understand what has happened to them. One of the participants talked about not wanting the world to think that the church that preaches love can't live it out, so you leave silently and quietly. I've got some quotes on this next slide. I'm not going to read them all out, but I will send the slides and they can be translated if that's helpful as well. But I just want to pick out a couple of points. In one of these quotes, in the grey box, you can see it says, "The wounds the church gave me rocked me to my very core." And there's another participant in the yellow box who talked about other experiences of abuse and how those had parallels with the experience of spiritual abuse. And the blue one about this attacking at the heart and the spirit of a person, which leaves you with the green box of walking that long, lonely, misunderstood road. So I think it's really important for us to understand these experiences and to understand how faith and belief, which can be hugely positive aspects of life, can also present ways in which people can be controlled and coerced. So this model here talks about the main impacts of the experience of spiritual abuse. And the biggest impact by far is distrust. The first thing I ever wrote in this area was called Unsafe in a Safe Place, because somebody had said to me, I was unsafe in the place I should have been the most safe. And now I don't know who's safe and what's safe anymore. So that's a really big impact of this experience. It makes it difficult for people to trust others. It makes it difficult both within a Christian context and outside. It makes intervention and support difficult. Many people talk about the feeling angry about what's happened. I've talked about fear. Some people feel very isolated when they leave because they might have spent much of their time in that context and they don't have other support available. Others talk about the importance and the impact on self and identity. Who are you now? Many people feel their belief system is shaken by these experiences. And there are lots of long-term impacts, therefore. People feel blamed or they blame themselves. And because of that continual shifting of reality, there's a lot of self-doubt and issues with trusting themselves. I think it's important to note that that personal experience that somebody has of spiritual abuse takes place within a broader spiritual context. So it might be within the Catholic faith context, it might be within other faith contexts, and that context is within a broader cultural context. So today it's lovely to hear that people are joining from all over the world to listen. But the context in which you are in will shape this experience. And so it's really important, I think, as we explore this, that across countries and across continents, we're looking at how do these experiences, what do they look like, and how are they experienced both for the individual within that spiritual context in which they occur, but also within that broader cultural context, which will have all kinds of differences in terms of how experiences are responded to, what the infrastructures are, etc. So it's really important to think through those things. It's also important to understand that you can have a spiritually abusive culture where the culture of an organization is controlling and coercive throughout. But you also might have an otherwise very healthy culture in which an individual or individuals are behaving coercively and controllingly to others. And actually, not everybody may be aware that that is happening. For example, you might have a church youth leader who is operating spiritually abusively within an otherwise healthy culture. And so those things are important to understand. I also said about the work that we've done. Much of the writing in this area, certainly when I started the work, was talking about church leaders, so ministers, clergy, priests, spiritually abusing members of their congregations or organizations. So that kind of top-down model. But what we found across the research is that many in leadership can be and are spiritually abused by those in perhaps their organizations or within leadership teams. And that might be very hidden. So for me, if we're going to talk about these issues and tackle them, we have to look at it across the whole board. And that's why, for me, the work on healthy cultures is so important, because we're trying to create cultures in which everybody thrives, and that includes leaders as well as members of congregations or organizations. And it's really important to say that, because in the research study we did in 2016-18, we found that a lot of leaders were writing to talk about their experiences. And so it's really important that we acknowledge that as part of this ongoing work. So what did we find then? Well, we found stories across denominations, across different expressions of the Christian faith, across church positions, and our work predominantly to date has been in the UK. But I really want that to change. So I'm hoping that there will be opportunities to work together as we move forward. One thing that we've also done is some mapping, which I think has been really helpful as we've explored these issues with churches, with congregations, with ministers, with priests, spiritual directors. And we started to look at this whole spectrum of behaviour. So at the one end, there's really healthy behaviour, which is really good, where people are growing and flourishing, and we need to get better at capturing that. So one of the things I've been encouraging the churches and organisations I've been working with to do is to actually identify what they're doing well. As we move along that spectrum, we might get to what we call unhelpful behaviour, which we all engage in at some times. We perhaps don't respond particularly well to a comment, or we don't listen particularly well, and that's unhelpful, and we all do that from time to time. As we move along, we might come to what we call more unhealthy behaviour, where we're starting to see patterns of coercion and control, where we might think through a conversation because we're worried about what the response will be. We might have watched other people being responded to incredibly negatively. And if it crosses a threshold into a persistent pattern of coercive, controlling behaviour that reflects psychological abuse, it could cross that threshold into spiritual abuse. That spectrum is really helpful to help us to identify where behaviour is, but also to be able to address behaviour before it escalates. And one of the things that I think we need to become better at is actually being able to challenge behaviour in a way that respects and values the individual, but stops that behaviour pattern from escalating. One of the other things that we have been looking at is the different kinds of power that exist within Christian organisations. And I think this is particularly relevant to what you term, I think is it conscience abuse, because actually I think this might be where, for the Catholic context, there's some real things to consider, particularly around relational power. So what's on the screen is different forms of power or influence. The top 6 were created by psychologists called French and Raven. And the bottom one was added by a German professor called Volker Kessler, and it was specifically for use within religious contexts. So I'm just going to talk through them very quickly, and then talk about why I think the relational power is particularly relevant. So reward power is do something and something good will happen to you. Coercive power is do something or something bad will happen to you. Legitimate power is the power often associated with a role. So that might have relevance to your context, where you might have people as priests or other roles within your context where there is a legitimate power. You have some power because you've been given a particular role. But what I think is really important is this relational power. The power we have in relationships with each other because of that relationship that we have developed. That is very powerful, and it's very powerful within Christian faith context. And I would say that in the work that I've done here with the Catholic Church, that's something that's come out really strongly. That relational power, the relationships that are built, is really important. So one of the things we are encouraging, particularly leaders, but everyone to think about, is how they use their relational power, either when they're leading or when they're following. Because actually you may be in a pastoral role, but you have a huge amount of power and influence over people because of the relationship you have built with them. My husband is a pastoral worker, and he's really aware of the relationships he has built with many people and the power and influence, therefore, that he has. And I think that's something that we encourage people to think through. So we might ask the question, what kind of power do you use when you're leading and when you're following? And get people to reflect on what are the strengths and positives of that type of power and influence, and what are some of the possible negatives. But in talking about these kinds of power, it also gets us to recognize they're operating within our context, and we become more aware of them, and therefore able to address it where power is perhaps not being used in the way that it should. Just so that you're not left thinking, what are the other 3? Informational power is just what it says, information that you might have. So if I had been given the wrong time to come to this meeting and I hadn't come, I would have looked dreadful, but it would have been because the information hadn't been shared. Expert power is the power, I guess, that I'm operating out of this afternoon. Here's the research that I've done that gives me some power to talk in this situation. Charismatic power is the power of personality. And again, that can be particularly pertinent to some of our contexts. And so it's really important to examine and reflect on the use of power within our contexts. One of the questions that I often ask people to consider is, would I want to be led by me? Would I want me as my priest, my leader, my pastoral worker? Are those things that would I want to be led by me? And that asks us to reflect on what is positive about our leadership and what might need to be reconsidered. And other aspects of the work that we're engaged in at the moment, really importantly, is responding to stories of spiritual abuse. So in the survey, we ask people, what does a good response, a healthy response to an experience of spiritual abuse look like? And people told us that they wanted to be listened to. They wanted to be taken seriously. Importantly, they didn't want the church defended or the individual defended. They also talked about being really careful about the use of prayer or the use of the Bible if that had been part of the experience that somebody had had. we also then went on to look at what are the hallmarks then of a healthy culture, because in a healthy culture, people thrive, but also we would hope that abuse would be more easily identified and responded to. And so some of those hallmarks are things like healthy accountability. They are nurturing and nurtured leadership. They are, I think one of the key ones is being valued and respected. You know when you are valued and respected. There are others as well that I won't go into because I'm aware of time, but we've been really working at looking at how do we create healthy cultures? So how do we hold on to what we're doing well and address some of the issues that I've talked about today, which are where people are experiencing harm, and doing both those things together so that we are building for a healthy future and healthy Christian cultures as we move forward. So I think the work that I've done within the Catholic faith has been hugely positive, some really positive conversations and training sessions. And I think the feedback that I've had from people is perhaps some of the key elements to think through are how power operates within Catholic organisations and all faith organisations, but also how the use of those different forms of power and how that relational power might be particularly important, but also reverential power and reverential fear that might be attached to it. Just to finish on a positive note, I think that there is lots of possibility for the future as we start to explore more fully what healthy cultures look like. We start to think about how we address harm and how we build for healthy cultures in which everyone thrives for the future. And so we're doing the work of looking at the harm, looking at spiritual abuse, but also looking at how do we respond well and how do we prevent these behaviours from occurring in the future. So I'm going to stop sharing now and say thank you and give people time to comment and reflect, and then I'll try and answer any questions that you have.
Thank you to you, Lisa Oakley. Muchas gracias por esta excelente presentación. Has dicho, if you raise a problem, you become a problem. Y aquí, esta mañana en Chile, this afternoon there in UK, nosotros estamos levantando el problema, raising the problem, and we want to do it, lo queremos hacer por cariño a cada una de las personas, al ser humano, y para generar espacios de cultura sana. A los participantes que se han incorporado al Zoom a lo largo de la exposición de Lisa para obtener la traducción, les damos la bienvenida en este Zoom. Quien quiera todavía incorporarse lo puede hacer para tener la traducción que se obtiene apretando el botón interpretación dentro de Zoom. Queremos saludar y dar la palabra al profesor Cristian Montes, profesor de Derecho Canónico de nuestra facultad, magíster por la Universidad Gregoriana, y también nuestro vicario judicial de nuestra Arquidiócesis de Santiago. Cristian, te damos la palabra a ti para una reacción, al mismo tiempo que queda abierta la posibilidad de hacer preguntas, ya sea por el chat de YouTube como por el chat de este Zoom.
Bien, muchas gracias por la invitación a este webinar, un tema muy interesante. Doy desde ya las felicitaciones a la profesora Lisa Oakley, quien ha dado una muy interesante explicación de este fenómeno, y quien desde la psicología y también desde su experiencia en el abuso infantil y de adultos, vinculado a la fe y a las creencias, ha investigado sobre el abuso espiritual de conciencia, realidad que sin duda impacta y que tal vez podemos reconocer también hoy día, lamentablemente en muchas iglesias particulares o en instituciones o movimientos de iglesia, como también en otros grupos con personas que tienen algún cierto liderazgo, ¿verdad? El lugar Alguien, decía la profesora, alguien se siente inseguro en un lugar donde debiera sentirse seguro. Esta realidad del abusador, si bien lo podemos identificar en personas determinadas, hay ciertos ambientes en los que favorecen o son el caldo de cultivo para que se produzca el abuso, tal vez por la huella que ha dejado un abusador en una comunidad y que en cierto grupo tiende a validar y a replicar como algo correcto, o por exageraciones que se van dando y que van configurando a un cierto grupo con características sectarias, de manera que esa forma de vivir la fe es la única forma de vivir y agradar a Dios. Tantas veces hemos visto estas circunstancias, ¿no? La manera de cómo puedes ejercer la vida cristiana o la fe es de acuerdo a cómo lo vemos nosotros, ¿no? El abuso espiritual de conciencia, por lo tanto, es una realidad muy compleja porque involucra, como lo definía la profesora, involucra las emociones desde el contexto religioso, desde la buena voluntad de un sujeto y desde su deseo o aspiración hacia una manera de vivir, hacia una vocación incluso, o incluso a su relación con su creador. El abusador aprovecha la buena voluntad de su víctima y el campo abierto para darse a todo lo necesario para complacer definitivamente a Dios. La víctima de esta manera se juega todo lo que tiene y posee, y en este sentido el abusador aprovecha, de tal manera que la víctima se siente estafada. Muchas veces esta realidad encuentra apoyos en una historia de una comunidad, en un contexto cultural o sociológico, como lo explicaba la profesora, también por ciertas carencias afectivas que también todo el mundo tiene, e incluso el abusador, fundamenta su actuar en ciertos pasajes de la palabra de Dios que son utilizados para apropiarse de la conciencia de sus víctimas y controlarlas en su totalidad. El libro de la doctora Lisa Oakley y Justin Humphrey, titulado Escapando del laberinto del abuso espiritual, que está siendo traducido también al español, y justamente busca cómo crear culturas cristianas sanas, que este libro fue publicado en inglés el año 2019. Mark Steve, que es un sobreviviente de abuso espiritual, cuenta su experiencia en la cual su líder espiritual utilizaba diversos textos de la Sagrada Escritura para arrogarse el lugar de Dios y desde ahí cometer toda clase de abusos. El título me parece muy bien puesto, porque cuando se entra en una dinámica de abuso, y que hoy la doctora Oakley ha logrado explicar muy bien, escapar de él es un camino solitario, difícil y arduo. El mismo Mark Steve cuenta cómo fue su experiencia al tratar de salir de él, ya que todos aquellos conocidos que frecuentaban el mismo grupo lo abandonaron despiadadamente, perdiendo sus redes de contacto, a lo cual se suma a que en la experiencia de abuso espiritual, el abusador previamente va rompiendo con todas las redes de amistad e incluso aquellas redes más primarias que son la propia familia. Para el abusado salir de este laberinto es en soledad y es un camino difícil. Este mismo camino vivido por Mark Steve, relatado en el libro de la doctora Oakley, es una realidad en muchos contextos de iglesia, lamentablemente, y que también he sido testigo de verlo en la práctica forense, en laicos y en sacerdotes que han vivido la experiencia del abuso espiritual. Muchas veces hay criterios de discernimiento que
to understand these experiences and to understand how faith and belief, which can be hugely positive aspects of...
¿Qué pasó? Muchas veces, decía, estos criterios de discernimiento se ven anulados porque no hay alternativas para tomar. La persona se ve en una especie de jaque mate y debe renunciar a sus emociones, a su propia conciencia, a sí mismo, porque es, entre comillas, la voluntad de Dios, mediada por este líder espiritual que debe imponer bajo pena de numerosos castigos y por lo tanto debe ser obedecida. Ocupa muchas veces ocupa esta palabra imponer, porque incluso se superpone al sujeto, de manera que la persona deja de ser ella misma y pasa a ser lo que quiere su propio abusador. En la presentación de la doctora Oakley llama la atención el carácter inverso del abuso que podría darse. En efecto, podría ser tradicional que cuando se habla de un abuso es una relación descendente, de arriba hacia abajo, es decir, desde una posición de poder en que aparentemente podría haber una cierta asimetría. Pero el autor en sus investigaciones menciona que ministros de la Iglesia pueden ser también abusados por aquellos que tienen una posición de poder más baja en la Iglesia. En efecto, creo que la relación asimétrica se da aún en estas circunstancias porque quien abusa se pone y suplanta en lugar de Dios. Y de esta manera hemos visto también cómo el abusador puede influir en ciertas decisiones de poder que tiene el abusado. En la antigüedad, en la doctrina canónica, incluso a esto se le llamaba plagio. Hoy se llama abuso. Y creo que tiene más sentido porque refiere a un proceso que se va dando paulatinamente, a veces imperceptible a la vista del abusado, más que en un acto particular y concreto, como puede significar el plagio. Me pareció bastante sugerente la explicación mediante el mapa que expuso la profesora Oakley, donde relata justamente cómo se va dando este proceso de abuso sexual. Ahora, ¿cuánto tiempo tarda en que esto se produzca? ¿Qué características se necesitan en el abusado para caer en esta red, podríamos decir, del abusador? Sin duda, la realidad del ser humano es compleja. Para tratar de responder esta pregunta, porque efectivamente cada persona tiene su propia realidad, sus propias circunstancias, su propia historia de vida por la cual se hace presente este abuso, ¿no? El acompañamiento espiritual podría llegar a ser también una gran ayuda, podría sacar quizás lo mejor de una persona en su camino, en su camino de fe, en su vivencia del Evangelio, pero también, lamentablemente, también con lo que nos ha expuesto y todas las encuestas que ha realizado la profesora, nos damos cuenta que muchas veces la persona es manipulada, explotada, deformada en su conciencia, desgraciada en definitiva, ¿no? Creando tal vez una serie de culpabilidades cuando no cumple aquellos roles impuestos, nuevamente digo impuestos por Dios, a través de este gurú o guía espiritual, ¿no? Estos roles impuestos, porque efectivamente se trata de algo que brota no desde la conciencia del sujeto en su relación con Dios, sino de lo que lícitamente le señala otra persona de lo que debe cumplir o hacer, propasando evidentemente esos límites personales y de la propia conciencia. Lamentablemente también desde la experiencia forense también me ha tocado ver justamente cómo muchas veces se ha propasado imponiendo justamente los criterios de un gurú espiritual, director espiritual por sobre, digamos, la originalidad que tiene una misma persona, ¿no? Y por eso en la relación del abuso espiritual de conciencia, también en el abuso sexual también, es importante hacer hincapié en el daño, ¿ah? En el daño del sujeto. Que ese daño que genera en la persona, ¿cómo se repara, ¿no? ¿Cómo se repara? ¿Cómo es posible que alguien que haya padecido ese daño pueda, podríamos decir, volver a la vida de una manera digna, de poder volver a la vida de una manera en que pueda restablecerse y, digamos, vivir en paz también, ¿no? Porque muchas veces el abuso deja una cierta, digamos, dolor interior que quizás la persona tiene que aprender a vivir con ese dolor, ¿no? Y cómo también preguntarse si esa persona, tal vez se lo pregunto a la profesora, digamos, tiene alguna particularidad de poder, si no ha hecho un proceso de discernimiento, de poder replicar ese daño o no. Hoy día, gracias a Dios también, creo que la iglesia chilena, bueno, a partir de todo lo que nos ha sucedido en los últimos años, ha emprendido un camino que todavía tal vez no ha terminado, ¿no? Un camino que busca efectivamente la prevención del abuso, busca justamente formarse, caminar un poco en esa línea, ¿no? De tal manera que lo que buscamos justamente es que la palabra de Dios sea la palabra de Dios que libere justamente a la esclavitud específicamente la esclavitud del pecado. Por eso tal vez quiero dejar así como pregunta, ¿no? En su experiencia, tal vez como psicóloga y también por lo que le ha tocado estudiar, ¿cómo una persona dañada puede salir adelante, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son, digamos, esos daños que usted obviamente también mencionó, ¿no? Esos daños y qué repercusiones tienen en el futuro para esa persona. Bien, eso más o menos quiero dejar así como preguntas abiertas, a ver si la profesora Oakley, a quien le agradezco mucho su exposición muy interesante, nos pueda iluminar.
Muchas gracias, Cristian. Ha dejado, junto con una estupenda reacción a la exposición de la profesora Lisa, ha dejado un par de preguntas y yo quisiera saber si hay Lisa ha tenido traducción para ellas, no estoy seguro. I want to ask Lisa if you have heard in English the questions.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I give you the word in order to answer. After that, I will give you another questions we have got.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much as well for the translation that went on there. So helpful. So the really great questions. First of all, thank you for the comments. If it's okay, before I take the questions, I'm just going to pick up on a few of the points that you raised, which I think are really important. This is a wide variety of experiences, and that we need to know more about that. You also talked about, I think, touched on intentionality, so whether people set out to do this. And I think there's a question about how we set up our Christian organizations, our churches, how we set up leadership, where people set out with the right intentions, but actually there's all kinds of reasons why you might end up behaving like this. And I think we need to talk about that, because it enables us to talk about the behaviors more. And you said about conscience being overtaken by the abuser. That was a really interesting phrase for me, because that explains why people don't know themselves or they don't trust themselves at the end of this experience. It's really positive to hear your response and the willingness to work in this area. Just in terms of the questions that you've got, you talk about spiritual guidance being a tradition within the Catholic Church. That's really interesting, because some of the recent work I've been doing is around spiritual direction or spiritual accompaniment. And some of the same principles apply to that kind of work. So some of the question is, how do we give spiritual direction or spiritual guidance? And I think there's some key answers. One of those is, of course, we don't want to stop people being able to give spiritual direction and guidance. That's not at all what the work is about. But how that is done really matters. How guidance is delivered and how much choice a person has about how they respond, I think, is really key. So those principles of respecting and valuing people are really important when we guide. But the principle of choice and how much choice somebody has to disagree with the guidance or perhaps to do something slightly differently is really important. So I think there's ongoing work about these issues, which is really important. And I think some of the characteristics of a healthy culture apply to healthy spiritual guidance, healthy spiritual direction. How can a spiritually abused person move forward after suffering abuse? Really important. We have done some work on this. We're needing to do more. That's definitely true. I think one of the answers I would say is that some of this responsibility is actually ours, in that we need to understand these issues to be able to facilitate people in a journey of moving forward. So I think that's the first thing, that we need to talk about this more so that people's experience can be acknowledged and understood. I think also we need to have good intervention and support services which understand. So for us, we have an organisation called Replenished. I can send the details of that organisation if it's helpful. They specifically support people who have had these experiences. So there are ways in which we can work with people. I think one of the other things I would say is, if you understand the experience and you listen to people who've had these experiences in your context, in your culture, that's really important, because then if somebody comes into your context with that experience, you are ready to respond in a way that is helpful and supportive. What are the main damages and consequences people experience from this kind of abuse? I think that the impact on trust is huge. That has an impact on your willingness to engage with, or ability to engage with, counselling or support. There is a huge impact on faith. So your belief about God, your belief about the church will be impacted by these experiences. And I really think it's important also to talk about the impact on your sense of self and identity, your ability to trust yourself and who you are as an individual. And I'd also want to say there's no one response from people. There's a variety of responses that people will have to these experiences. But it's really important to understand the depth of this experience for people, because that quote about it attacks the heart and spirit of the person, it encompasses you emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, socially, culturally. It has a huge impact. And because we don't talk about these experiences in the same way we talk about other experiences of abuse, people don't even know that their story can be acknowledged. And so we've got a lot of work to do. I think that's probably hopefully some helpful answers to those questions.
Muchas gracias, profesora. Tenemos una cantidad importante, interesante de preguntas y reacciones que quienes estamos en el Zoom podemos leer en el chat, y que yo intentaré, en honor al tiempo, unir o agrupar un poco para que profesora Lisa nos pueda dar una reacción. Una de las preguntas, one of the questions we have is about the description of the parallel between the conscious and spiritual abuse and other kinds of abuse in church, getting aware that other abuses, particularly the sexual abuse or other more visible, to name it, and that's actually the question. It seems like the spiritual abuse is difficult to be put it in its importance, and for the same reason, it's difficult to denounce and to go to take the correct I'm losing, but if you can, Professor Lisa.
Yes, definitely. I think a few things to say that we know from our work that where people experience other forms of abuse within and we're talking about today within a Christian faith context, but of course across faith contexts, those so for example, sexual abuse or physical abuse, they almost inevitably will have an aspect of spiritual abuse within them because of the context in which they're being experienced. And so it's really important for us to understand that, because that helps us understand those experiences better as well. I think probably one of the kind of key bits of what you're saying is this is difficult to define, it's difficult to identify, and therefore it's difficult to respond to. I would agree with that a bit. I think that we do need to work on definitions, but definitions of abuse develop over time and over understanding. I think we have some core characteristics now that we can look at and see what's happening. We can look at where things are situated on that spectrum. And I think we do have some keys into how to respond to these stories in a way that's helpful. So when we did the survey, we asked people, what does a good response look like? And they told us what they wanted people to say and what they didn't want people to say. And we've got some of that we can share if it's helpful. I think I'm going to just say that it would be really great to do some more joint research to find out what are people in your context saying would be helpful, because it may not be the same. They may not be the same things. And so that's where I think we need to work together to develop things.
Thank you, Lisa. Another question we have about in Catholic tradition and speaking of priesthood in this tradition where we are here in the Faculty of Theology in University Catholic of Chile. The question is, in this tradition, Catholic priesthood has a great position of power. So the question is, how can the priest handle this dangerous situation to create a healthier relationship with faithful? I would add, particularly myself, if it is possible, or what kind of difference in priesthood we can also add. So the priest himself and also the culture, the church. Talking of the power of priesthood in Christian tradition.
I think really important questions. I think one of the keys is for priests to think about, just to actually think about the use of power, to have it as something that is talked about, to think about the different kinds of power that are used. And power is not a bad thing in and of itself. It can be a very good thing. We can affect change through power. But I think being self-reflective is really important. So I would encourage that ongoing reflection, and that being inbuilt from training all the way through, I think is really important. I also think, though, sometimes we expect in this situation priests to be all things to all people, to have all the answers, all the skills, all the abilities. No one can do all that. So there's something about challenging ourselves about how we think about leadership that is important. In terms of congregations and members, I think it's about the healthy culture stuff. Everybody is part of the culture. So the conversation I have with somebody else in my church on Sunday is part of the culture. So we have a responsibility ourselves also for the cultures that we're part of. And that's why looking at the whole culture is so important.
Thank you, Lisa. Again, a question about leadership and the power from leadership. Talking of the information, and the question is, we got it from the YouTube. What would you say could be a way to avoid the spiritual abuse related to information? Information as power, meaning that the content of faith isn't supposed to be guarded and provided by those who committed the abuse.
I think what I would say in terms of information, I think I'm understanding the question right, but I think there's two things I'd say. One is that we need to get better at communicating. Is something we could all get better at. And so we need to ask ourselves why we're holding on to certain information. But the other side is there are very good reasons sometimes why you wouldn't share information. And a safeguarding concern would be one of those. So one of the things I would say in stories of spiritual abuse, the kind of confidentiality we would keep with other experiences of abuse, we don't keep with this very well. So we might be sharing people's stories far beyond what we would share a story of domestic violence or sexual abuse. And we need to really be careful about that. So I think general information, we need to get better at sharing. Information about these stories, we need to be really clear what the boundaries on that are. And importantly, the person who's sharing that story know what's going to happen with their story when they share it. I think that's really important. What we do also see a lot of is defense. So when somebody shares a story, there's a very defensive response, either to defend the church or the individual. And that really stops you from sharing your story. So I think we've got to get better at the way in which we listen as well.
Thank you, Lisa. Maybe another question. We can, we are receiving different questions. I'm trying to systemize that about the congregations and not much from leaders, but the congregation in general. How to? I know you have already said, give us very good insights, but again, Roberto asks, how can we form the groups, the congregation, lay people in Catholic tradition, in order to they be more aware of the abuse in general, and being so are more able to react. To react and to protect themselves and others from abuse.
I think there's a few answers to that. I think we need to talk about these issues. When we listen, if you think about what we share from the front of our churches, what we talk about in our messages that we give, do we ever talk about these things? There was a really interesting study done where people were asked what they preached on, whether they'd ever preached about domestic violence, whether they'd ever preached on any of these issues. So I think that's the challenge, is what we need to be talking about these things in a sensitive, appropriate way, but we do need to talk about them. I also think we need to be talking about this as whole communities. We're one body, we're one family. So we need to talk about it openly. What kind of community do we want to be? What kind of people do we want to be? How do we want to agree to get there? I think often what we might do is actually share something about here's what we're going to be without actually talking to the people we're working with. That's really important, because then everybody has a responsibility. So if somebody isn't treating somebody well, it doesn't have to be the priest who intervenes, because as a culture we've decided this is who we want to be. So I think it's been very positive working alongside churches and organisations and seeing people start to have conversations about what are our core values, who do we want to be as communities, but actually talking openly about some of these issues in a sensitive way, but in a way that acknowledges that they're there. one of the most powerful moments I think I've ever had was when I talked about spiritual abuse at a conference, and somebody came to me that night in tears and said, nobody has ever talked about my experience. I've never heard it talked about. And now I've got a language to talk about what happened to me. I think we need to do it sensitively and carefully, but we need to do it. I can see a question that's in English, but I don't know if we're out of time, so I'm just going to...
Please go ahead. Viviana, okay. Help us translating her own question, so thank you.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. So you've talked about recognition of spiritual abuse and the early stages in which it starts, so positive experiences, new people having good experiences. That's what we would want, isn't it? That's what we'd want anyway. And then because spiritual abuse is difficult to be recognised and the congregations don't have the genuine interest to repair the victims, sometimes because of monetary reasons, do these create an environment where new and future abuses can happen? I think that's a really excellent question. I could write a whole chapter on the answer to that question, but I'll try and be succinct. I think that there is a problem that we don't recognise it, and so that does work against us responding well. I think there are sometimes monetary reasons why we don't respond well. I think there are lots of other reasons as well. I think we don't respond well because we don't understand. I think we don't respond well because we're worried that there will be more negative things said about church. I think we don't respond well because we might have much more understanding of other forms of abuse than we do of this. So I think, yes, if one of the things that I would say where we are at the moment is because we're not responding, we might create a situation in which somebody can carry on behaving in that way to a number of different people because we've not actually addressed it. And we've seen that, haven't we, in other forms of abuse where we don't intervene and respond, then actually that person can continue to perpetrate that kind of behaviour. So again, I think that's why we need to talk about this, we need to acknowledge it, and we need to respond. But brilliant question, thank you.
Thank you, Viviana. And we have already some time for a last question, Lisa. We received it from YouTube from Hadi Bello. She's a professor in our faculty. She thanked you and she asked if, in your opinion, there is any chance or to change the current model of spiritual guidance, and what would you propose as the most urgent improvement to do this spiritual guidance change? Okay,
so the short answer is yes. There's always opportunity to change. There always is. So that's my short answer. I think the urgent thing is really to reflect on how spiritual guidance is given, and to think about how then it's received. So how it's given and how it's received. And I think again, for me, it's about talking about some of these things. You know, you can give I can give my students lots of guidance. They can choose whether to follow it or not. And I think there's something there that we need to explore more. So I think open the conversation. I'd love to continue a conversation about spiritual guidance. I think it's really interesting because this is what came out of a session I did last week in the UK. This is a real area that people are starting to think really carefully about. So I think, yes, we can change it. I think we do need to think about how it's delivered and how people receive it. But I think there is work that can be done.
Thank you, Lisa. We want to ask you in your intervention 2 minutes ago, you mentioned an institution you work in offering a company support to have good interventions, about good interventions. You offer the address, if you can give us.
Oh, replenished. What I can do, if it's helpful, is it helpful for me to email the contact details? So if you, in fact, I can probably very quickly pop them in the chat if you just give me 1 moment.
That would be very useful. Thank you.
Let me just look them up. Hold on. Yeah, so this is just going on that.
Vamos a pedir a Paz, que está haciendo el soporte técnico, que esta información la pueda reenviar al chat de YouTube, de manera que quienes nos escuchan.
Sorry, hold on 1 moment. I need to just change that to that so you can all see it. So that's the website of the organization, and yeah, people can contact. I'll let them know.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for all this morning, this afternoon for you, naming the abuse, putting out the problem of the abuse. So in order to make a strong step forward to get out of this and to create healthy cultures in church. Muchas gracias, Lisa Oakley. Muchas gracias a todos los que han participado. Sí, I don't know if you we are getting out of time, but probably we have some last minute for you to. We don't have any further questions, but if you want to add any further.
Yeah, just to say thank you for opening up the conversation. Thank you for inviting me. Really, it's just a huge privilege, and I think it's really encouraging to see this being taken so seriously. I just want to thank you for that, and I want to thank you for inviting me, and I'm hoping that we can continue the conversation between us and see what we can do together. But it's just a huge privilege, and I'm really, really grateful.
Muchas gracias entonces a la profesora Lisa Oakley. Hemos tenido la excelente posibilidad de tener su presentación larga, con un buen tiempo para preguntas. Muchas gracias al profesor Cristian Montes por su valiosa reacción. Muchas gracias a la Facultad de Teología de la Universidad Católica por generar este espacio. Profesor Cristian Borgoño, que ha sido el especial curador, también Cristian Hodge, que es parte de este proyecto de investigación. Quiero dejarle una especial invitación a quienes nos escuchan en Chile y quienes tengan interés por la lectura en español de la profesora Lisa Oakley y coautora del libro Escaping the Mess of Spiritual Abuse, que será prontamente traducido, está pronto a salir desde el Centro Cuida de la Universidad Católica. Está ahí muy pronto y esperamos que esté disponible para ustedes. Escapando del laberinto del abuso espiritual, cómo crear culturas cristianas sanas, de la profesora Lisa Oakley y Justin Humphreys. Les doy las gracias por la atención, por la participación, por las interesantes preguntas y los despido en esta tarde a nombre de la Facultad de Teología.
Gracias.